Hello, everybody. Welcome. So, this lecture, we are going to dive into the topics of neoliberalism, neocolonialism, and the resource curse in terms of resource dependency. Now, you may be saying these seem a little bit disconnected from environmental justice. And the reason that I bring these up is I want to think about things from a global perspective and also within the systems we operate. These have huge implications for environmental work, environmental consequences, but also kind of as the systems or root causes of environmental injustices, right? These are not just abstract economic concepts, but really material systems and structures that determine who benefits from environmental resources and who bears the costs, right? So very heavily tied to distributional justice. And understanding these dynamics, it's really essential for EJ analysis because it really gives us a bigger picture of how these concepts and ideas and structures are shaping the context within these, local conflicts or challenges are occurring. So by the end of this session, you should be able to really understand and analyze what we're talking about in terms of neoliberalism as a political project, and understand how this has been implemented through specific policies in specific historical moments, not just as a natural economic order. Okay, that's very important. We're going to trace neocolonial continuities through debt, trade, institutional arrangements. We're going to examine the resource curse mechanisms and evaluate, what that means and how this applies in terms of empirical terms. We're going to critique extractivism as both a mode of accumulation, but also a relation to nature and assess structural adjustments, environmental consequences. And we're going to apply these frameworks to conservation finance and green transitions as an example, okay? We're going to go through a lot of terms. Just follow along with me. Again, you can always reach out with questions. This is kind of getting into, back into political ecology, kind of straying into political economies. Some of these terms may be totally new for you. Some of these concepts may be a little bit hard to wrap your head around. But just bear with me, and you can always, drop me notes. We can always meet in office hours if any of this is confusing or you want to kind of dive deeper, okay? So neoliberalism has genealogy, like many of the concepts that we talk about, right, in this course. The Mont Pelerin Society, formed in 1947, which brought together Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and other thinkers in this idea of developing free market ideology in response to the New Deal policies and European social democracy. So Chile, under Pinochet from 1973, became the first sort of national laboratory for this. The University of Chicago trained economists called the Chicago Boys. They were implementing radical privatization and deregulation under authoritarian conditions. And Reagan and Thatcher, they really consolidated these policies in the 1980s in the United States, the United Kingdom, right? And then in 1989, the Washington Consensus really codified these principles as policy prescriptions for the global South. The idea was that privatization of state enterprises, deregulation of industries, trade liberalization, fiscal austerity, property rights, emphasis, and reduction state capacity was really the way forward. And these policies were presented as economic common sense, but they are historical choices with specific origins and beneficiaries, right? So a lot of us have grown up in this era where this is kind of just the rule of law, the lay of the land, the natural way of doing things. And it's very important to remember that these systems were created. It didn't just happen like this. This wasn't a natural creation. So neoliberalism fundamentally has transformed the relationships we have to nature and fundamentally impacts the way we see nature today and the way that environmental justice has manifested, the way that conservation work takes place, the way that environmental action and environmental policies are shaped and used to address some of our world's most challenging struggles like climate change, right? So the ecosystem services discourse is one of the largest of these prescriptions. This was formalized through the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005. And this really frames nature as a provider of measurable services with economic value. So the idea of PES, or Payment for Environmental Services schemes, These now operate in over 550 programs globally. They really seek to commodify conservation by, in many cases, paying landowners to maintain forests or watersheds. So this is really a conservation through an economic benefit model. Carbon markets financialize the atmosphere of this, creating tradable pollution permits where companies can buy the right to pollute. Water, forests, and genetic resources also face privatization pressures. The enabling business environment rhetoric justifies regulatory rollbacks, especially in many of the political institutions we see globally today, in the name of this sort of attracting investment, especially in very difficult global economic times. And environmental impact assessments have really become procedural requirements that rarely, if ever, halt projects. They are often conducted after project approval, as we talked about with FPIC. And these transformations are not incidental to neoliberalism. They are very much central to how it organizes environmental governance. So, structural adjustment programs, these were imposed by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank from the 1980s through the 2000s. And these really had devastating environmental consequences. Conditionalities were attached to loans, and they required export-oriented growth. This was often in primary commodities like timber, minerals, and cash crops. And currency devaluation really made exports more competitive internationally, which then incentivized increased extraction. Okay, so you see how this kind of creates a very harmful system for some of these economies and struggling nations. So environmental ministry budgets were just slashed under these austerity requirements. It was really designed to reduce regulatory capacity as a whole. And you also had subsidies that were affecting rural livelihoods removed. This was really forcing farmers more in line with this market dependency. A really key example of this is Ghana's cocoa expansion, which really intensified deforestation. You had logging in the Philippines, which was accelerated, which resulted in watershed degradation and increased flooding. You had huge increases in copper mining, especially in Zambia, which expanded without environmental controls and created severe pollution. And these outcomes, they were not accidental, but they followed directly from these policy mandates that prioritized these export earnings and debt repayment over this idea of environmental protection. So neocolonialism kind of enters the fray, and this is, as a concept, was articulated by Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president in 1965, and he described it as the last stage of imperialism, where economic control substitutes for direct political rule after formal decolonization. So in this time period, we saw this sort of imperialism, on the surface being reduced, and the kind of colonial era of the past disappearing, but taking on a new form. And these new forms were mechanisms like debt service obligations that consume government budgets, asymmetrical trade agreements that really favored former colonial powers, and aid conditionalities that shaped many domestic policies in up-and-coming economies and growing countries. Structural adjustment programs, as we talked about, were major mechanisms, and also military presence through bases and intervention. There's a book by Walter Rodney called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And this book documents how wealth extraction during colonialism created the conditions for contemporary underdevelopment. Anibal Quijano's Coloniality of Power framework sheds light on how colonial hierarchies persist through, as we talked about, through structural and slow violence, epistemic, economic, and social structures long after political independence or colonial independence. And these scholars are really showing and providing analytical tools for examining how these continuities between colonial and contemporary periods, rather than assuming that decolonization ended these exploitative relationships. Okay. Contemporary neocolonialism mechanisms, they operate through specific documentable arrangements. In the Global South, Debt totaled 11.4 trillion US dollars in 2023. And debt service is just consuming resources that could fund education, healthcare, and enhanced environmental protection and justice. Debt for nature swaps are often promoted as win-win solutions, like trade sovereignty for conservation finance. And in these schemes, creditors and NGOs determine the conservation priorities, right? So it's troublesome. It's troublesome and again strips power away from local communities. You also have export processing zones in dozens of countries that offer tax holidays and minimal regulation. These create spaces where labor and environmental protections are suspended or undermined. You also have the land matrix projects, which documents 88 million hectares in large-scale land acquisitions since 2008, which have been taken place predominantly in Africa and Southeast Asia, where we see just massive amounts of disposition of land from local communities. They're losing access to these lands that they use for generations, all in sort of the name of these different mechanisms. You also have bilateral investment treaties. So you have grant corporations, which have the rights to sue states through investor-state dispute settlements for regulations that affect profits. An example is like Chevron versus Ecuador and Vattenfall versus Germany. These demonstrate how corporations can really challenge environmental regulations and win. And these are not market transactions between equals, but really legally structured power asymmetries. Again, we're seeing power surface again. And this really comes down to an idea or a concept called the resource curse, right? So the resource curse literature emerged from Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner's 1995 study showing an inverse correlation between resource wealth and GDP growth, which you might say, what? That it seems paradoxical, right? But countries with abundant oil, minerals, or other valuable resources, although they should be wealthy, many are quite impoverished. And in this sort of theory, proposed mechanisms include a concept called Dutch disease, where resource exports appreciate currency, making other economic sectors uncompetitive. So this kind of ties into some other ideas like rent seeking, which describes competition for access to resource revenues rather than productive economic activity. This goes hand in hand with weak institutional development, which often results because resource rents reduce government need for taxation. So you're breaking accountability links with citizens and removing a lot of social safety nets. However, there are counter examples that do complicate this narrative, right? It's never, so easy or so black and white. Botswana and Norway are both resource rich, but have avoided this curse. Michael Ross's 2012 study found that oil states are 1.5 times more authoritarian than non-oil states, which is quite interesting. And this, suggests that resources may undermine democracy in some situations. Humphrey, Sachs, and Stiglitz in 2007 published research that argued the curse is conditional on governance, not inevitable. And over 50 countries depend on petroleum for more than 25% of export earnings, so it's important to keep that in mind. These empirical patterns are real, but they require further explanation beyond just sort of resource presence alone, creating this paradoxical relationship. And there are, specific mechanisms that explain some resource curse dynamics. Again, going back to Dutch disease, this was named after the Netherlands' natural gas discoveries in the 1960s. This describes how resource exports appreciate currency, which then, pricing, manufacturing, agricultural exports out of international markets. Other economic sectors atrophy, which creates dangerous dependency on a single commodity. Venezuela is a good example of this in terms of oil. Rent seeking is going to mean where actors compete for access to resource revenues through political connections and corruption rather than engaging in productive entrepreneurship or innovation. Also, can be thought of as a kleptocracy. Commodity price volatility will create these boom and bust cycles, and during the booms, the governments will increase spending, But during the busts, they are facing fiscal crises and they can't quickly cut expenditures, which really puts the entire system in jeopardy. Institutional quality may decline in these situations because governments funded by resource rents don't need to tax citizens, as we mentioned, and this is, again, breaking down that relationship. And then conflict can result when these contestable point source resources like oil fields or diamond mines are then captured and then fall out of state control in some situations. And all of this ties to environmental degradation, which is then accelerated as immediate extraction is prioritized over this long-term protection and goals. These mechanisms have empirical support. But again, they operate differently depending on the specific context, and especially related to history. So, resource curse, it faces important critiques that we should consider, right? It often ignores, some scholars posit, geographic and temporal specificity, right? Why do some resource-rich countries avoid the curse while others experience severe versions? Colonial history, though, is a major confounding variable. Countries colonized specifically for resource extraction inherited institutions designed for extraction, benefiting colonial powers, not for diversified domestic development. And also the theory often assumes institutions were weak before resource wealth, rather than investigating whether resources caused this institutional weakness. Ola Aderbij's 2020 work on Nigeria argues that the nation's governance curse is actually a governance curse, not a resource curse. And then Michael Watts in 2004 suggested that the resource curse language is depoliticizing what are actually deliberate policy choices that are benefiting specific actors, particularly political elites and multinational corporations, right? So it's kind of a smokescreen. And some scholars prefer resource governance failures as more accurate framing because it focuses attention on policy choices, again, rather than this deterministic, nihilistic resource effects kind of language. And again, these critiques don't invalidate the observed patterns, but again, we are critical scholars in this course, and we're getting into these sort of more nuanced causal analyses that needs to account for systemic factors. And, resource dependency is tricky, right? It creates structural vulnerability that transcends individual decision-making, right? Export concentration ratios, exceed 90% in countries like Libya, Iraq, Angola. This means their economies have almost no diversification and are entirely dependent on oil prices, which is then in turn dependent, by the global markets. The Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, which was developed by economist Raoul Prebisch and Hans Singer, this suggests that the terms of trade for primary commodities, they decline relative to manufactured goods over long periods. And this creates persistent disadvantage for countries that are exporting raw materials, right? So countries competing for foreign investment, they face these races to the bottom on this regulation and taxation environment as these governments are just like constantly undercutting each other to attract more mobile capital. And in this scenario, these manufacturing sectors, again, they atrophy when these resources are dominating the economy. It makes diversification increasingly difficult, if not impossible. And then you have a reality like food insecurity, which can then result when this agricultural land converts from food production to just constant and solely focused crop export. A good example of this is in Thailand, that experienced shifts from rice cultivation to cassava production under this sort of export incentive pressures in the 1990s and 2000s. This dependency was structural in that it was embedded by trade relationships, and infrastructure was built to export these specific commodities. Labor force skill development, institutional capacities, these were all developed, but they can't quickly change, right? So countries in this situation, like especially Thailand, became locked into this position in this global commodity chain, and it just becomes really, really difficult for them to escape, which is very difficult, and then creates systems of injustice that are reinforcing. A key example that I often share is Nigeria's, Niger Delta. This is a really concrete illustration of the resource curse that is often mentioned in coursework and in texts. And this really shows strong connections to environmental justice as well. So in Nigeria, oil was discovered in 1956 in Olibri, and production began in 1958. Companies like Shell, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Total, they were operating major fields, oil fields in this region. Between 1960 and 2020, Nigeria earned approximately 600 billion in oil revenues, which was over 90% of export earnings since 1970s. That's a huge reliance on oil. Yet national poverty rates remain around 40%. And in the Delta states where oil is extracted, poverty exceeds 60%. The wealth from oil has just not translated into broad-based development. Environmental destruction is severe and ongoing. Gas flaring continues despite regulations. This is where they are flaring off harmful chemicals into the atmosphere, causing health impacts to nearby communities. It releases toxins that are contributing to climate change. And cumulative oil spills total approximately 13 million barrels in this region. This is contaminated water, soil, fisheries that these communities depend on, right? This is a serious environmental justice violation. The Ogoni people have formed a resistance movement led by Kin Sarawiwa and the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People. This challenged Shell's operations. Sarawiwa was executed by the Nigerian government in 1995. This was widely viewed as retaliation for his environmental activism. Mosop's lawsuit against Shell has been ongoing, still ongoing today, since 1996, and is still unresolved, right? This case, really demonstrates classic environmental injustice, right? You have this benefit concentration in government and corporate hands, while these costs, these externalities are distributed to communities through pollution, health impacts, and then, livelihood destruction, and resistance is trampled and put down. Recognitional procedural justice is, pushed down through structural means. And again, there's examples like this all over the globe. The Democratic Republic of Congo is another example. Ecuador versus Chevron Texaco. This one is really, really wild. I'll share a documentary on this one in the module. Again, many of these are ongoing. And Eduardo Galeano's 1971 book, Open Veins of Latin America, this is a great book. And it documents how resource extraction has or was constitutive of Latin American underdevelopment. It was not incidental to it, right? The region's wealth was extracted to finance European and North American development, creating the conditions for contemporary inequality. And this is not just in oil and gas. This was in, resources like bananas, grains, livestock. Alberto Acosta, an Ecuadorian economist and former energy minister, this individual distinguishes extractivism as a mode of relating to nature from extraction as an activity, right? Extractivism treats nature purely as resource for accumulation, regardless of social or ecological consequences, right? It's a relationship characterized by intensive exploitation, export orientation, and minimal processing before export, right? So Maristela Svampa, an Argentine sociologist, identifies a concept of commodities consensus that was, sought to replace the Washington consensus in the 2000s. And as we mentioned, where the Washington consensus emphasized this privatization and deregulation, this commodities consensus describes how left and right governments alike, they depend on primary commodity exports for revenue. Tough. Progressive extractivism in Bolivia under Evo Morales, Ecuador under Rafael Correa, and Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. This is a prime example of resource rents being used to fund social programs that dramatically improved living standards and reducing poverty. However, these critics argue that this extractivism under any political system, remains environmentally destructive. And these countries don't, always have, Venezuela, for instance, does not have a very good human rights record, right? So this perpetuates this dependency on this volatile commodity price and really locks these countries into positions as resource suppliers in global economies, which is not a good environment for environmental justice, right? So post-extractivism debates have emerged in Latin America that ask whether viable alternatives exist, how do we get there, right? Beyond these extractive development models, or whether these, some people argue donut economies are just utopian fantasies, right? Given economic global structures that, demand this continuous resource flow, right? This is not something that we can easily just switch off or change from. And we really see this transform in contemporary and today's terms in sort of green extractivism, right? This really describes how this renewable energy transition we're experiencing requires massive increases in mineral extraction. And this is potentially just reproducing these patterns of environmental injustice under this sort of guise of sustainability, right? The International Energy Agency projects that mineral demand for clean energy technologies will increase sixfold by 2040 to meet the Paris Agreement goals. Specific minerals that will be needed include lithium for batteries, cobalt for battery cathodes, copper for electrical systems, rare earth elements for wind turbines and motors, nickel for battery anodes, lithium extraction. All of this incredibly degradative and incredibly socially unjust in many situations, right? Lithium extraction is very heavily concentrated in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, or in Bolivia, sorry, in what's called, as some people have termed it, the lithium triangle. This is home to over 60% of the global reserves. The Salar de Atacama, in Chile is the world's largest lithium production site, and this consumes approximately 65% of the regional water for extraction and processing in an already extremely arid desert landscape. The Antai indigenous communities oppose this expansion. They have documented impacts on aquifers, wetlands, and flamingo habitats. You also see this in Indonesia, which has been converting rainforest at massive scales for nickel smelters. Oof, it's so full of so much pollution needed to process these ore for batteries. You also see communities in Morowali and elsewhere facing displacement. The concept of green sacrifice zones has become an emerging idea in this space, which captures how indigenous lands have become extraction sites for global climate goals that are decided elsewhere, right? Predominantly by global north countries and corporations. As we see time and time again with climate change and climate injustice, the countries that are producing the least amount of emissions are often doing the most amount of unjust labor to help offset the pollution and the externalities of the global north. And they're also bearing the most consequences of flooding and climate change related disaster that is produced not by their countries or even their geographies. Right, so again, this is raising more environmental justice questions I want you to consider, right? Is it acceptable to sacrifice some communities and ecosystems for broader global climate objectives, right? Who decides which communities bear these costs, right? And how is this any different from historical patterns of colonialism or extraction? So carbon markets are an example I use a lot and a very poignant example in our current space. So this is, really a demonstration of neo-colonial dynamics in this contemporary challenge of climate governance, right? So the Paris Agreement, Article 6, established these mechanisms for international carbon trading. And this was going to allow countries and companies to meet emission targets by purchasing offsets in other locations. Let me take a drink. Hold on. So the voluntary carbon market, is separate from compliance markets. It reached $2 billion in 2021 and is projected to exceed $50 billion by 2030, according to industry estimates. RED Plus projects, which we've talked about, focus on reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. These now cover approximately 49 million hectares under contracts between government, NGOs, and companies. However, a major 2023 investigation by The Guardian and corporate accountability nonprofit Source Material found that over 90% of rainforest offset credits from the world's largest certifier were likely worthless, providing no actual emission reductions. Chew on that for a moment. Many of the projects, they just overestimated baseline deforestation rates, right? They claimed credit for protecting forests that weren't threatened or failed to ensure any sort of permanence, right? Projects in Kenya, Tanzania, Peru, Indonesia have restricted community land access for carbon sequestration. It's created a whole new form of colonialism, carbon colonialism, where global north consumption continues by purchasing this land control in the south, and continuing to pollute in the guise that they're protecting lands that were already being stewarded by indigenous communities. You have major certification bodies like Vera and Gold Standard facing scandals over phantom offsets and baseline manipulations, just completely manipulating the data. Carbon markets have thus just really allowed polluters to continue emissions, right, while claiming carbon neutrality, right, through questionable offsets that externalize these environmental costs to global south communities who are losing access to land and livelihoods. They're having their entire nations flooded, experiencing massive hurricanes and typhoons, huge droughts. It's unbelievable, right? So, yeah, conservation finance, environmental finance through debt restructuring, this raises some real fundamental sovereignty concerns. Conservation International, they restructured over $1 billion in sovereign debt through debt for nature swaps since pioneering this model in Bolivia in 1987. The Seychelles in 2016 restructured $22 million in debt in exchange for protecting 410,000 square kilometers of marine area, approximately 30% of its exclusive economic zone. Ecuador in 2023, $1.1 billion in debt consolidated to expand the Galapagos Marine Reserve protection, right? These arrangements appear, again, to create win-win outcomes. Countries are reducing their debt burdens, oceans and forests are gaining protection. However, the conditionality built into these arrangements, again, it replicates structural adjustment patterns, right? Creditors, often working with conservation NGOs, they gain oversight over protected area management. They do the monitoring and enforcement. And then sovereignty from local communities is traded for debt relief, right? External actors are then going to determine conservation priorities and methods. I mean, is this environmental justice? Adams and Hutton in 2007 described this dynamic as coercive conservation, right? Where financial pressure achieves outcomes that would not occur through negotiated consent, through FPIC, right? The question becomes, who designs the conservation priorities when external creditors and international NGOs hold this financial leverage, right? Communities are affected by protection. Now they face restricted resource access or displacement. They have minimal input into arrangements negotiated between governance, creditors, conservation organizations. They have no grievance or redress mechanisms. It's been sold away. And what can the government do? 1.1 billion of debt restructured. Now everybody's just kind of hamstrung by the situation. And large international conservation NGOs, they're part of this, right? They operate with substantial budgets that they fit within these fundamentally neoliberal frameworks, right? WWF, World Wildlife Fund, has an annual budget of approximately 1.1 billion. Right? It's more than some nation states. The Nature Conservancy, 1.2 billion. Conservation International, 220 million, right? These organizations, they maintain corporate partnerships that raise, serious questions about conflicts of interest, right? Shell partners with WWF on conservation projects despite Shell's role in fossil fuel extraction and environmental destruction in Nigeria's Delta, which we just talked about. Disney partners with Conservation International while its theme parks and resorts have significant environmental footprints. Market-based conservation mechanisms like carbon credits, biodiversity offsets, and payments for ecosystem services, these financialize nature. These create opportunities for profit. Boucher and Fletcher, in their incredible book, The Conservation Revolution, they, analyze what they term accumulation by conservation, where conservation itself becomes a mechanism for capital accumulation rather than challenging it, right? It's just a wing of the capitalist system, right? Fortress conservation approaches that exclude or displace communities, they continue under market mechanisms. They are just repackaged as win-win solutions. And, Corporate responsibility, CSR campaigns, board composition of these organizations, they typically include corporate executives and philanthropists with limited representation from affected communities or global south conservation practitioners, right? These organizational structures, these financing models and partnerships that are shaping environmental policies around the globe, methods and whose interests are ultimately served, this is just conservation completely integrated into the capitalist structures that many argue are destroying the planet. It's just a complete integration rather than a challenge. And it's complete greenwashing in some situations. So, it's tough. Again, a lot of things we talk about in this course are tough, but there are alternatives and resistance, right? So resistant movements and alternative frameworks have been developed and are really, gaining traction. These frameworks demonstrate that, current structures are not inevitable. They're not natural. But they represent specific configurations of power that can be challenged or changed, right? Bolivia's water wars in 2000, this, really intense conflict successfully reversed privatization of the Cochabamba's water system after massive protests against rate increases that were imposed by a corporation. Bolivia's nationalization of gas resources in 2006 under President Evo Morales reclaimed resource sovereignty using revenues to fund social programs. Arturo Escobar's post-development framework seeks alternatives to development as a concept, not just alternative development models. He argues that development as a paradigm, whether capitalist or socialist, requires questioning because it assumes linear progress and Western modernity as universal goals, which are not the universal accepted way of life around the globe, right? Buen vivir, one of my favorites, meaning good living in Spanish, was incorporated into Ecuador's 2008 constitution and Bolivia's 2009 constitution. This draws on indigenous Quechua and Aymara philosophies of Sumak Kosei and Sumak Huama. It offers non-Western development frameworks that emphasize harmony with nature, community well-being, and reciprocity rather than material accumulation. Degrowth scholarship is huge, including Jason Hickel's work that argues that infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible, and that reducing material throughput, particularly in the global north, is necessary for both justice and sustainability as a fundamental concept, right? The ICCA consortium has documented approximately 2 billion hectares in community conserved areas worldwide, showing that indigenous local communities are effectively conserving biodiversity often more successfully than state-managed protected areas, right? That's huge. You have another idea of Via Campesina, representing approximately 200 million members globally, that advances food sovereignty as alternative to industrial agriculture and, eating and growing locally and trying to break these corporate food systems. You have the Zapatista autonomous zones in Chiapas, Mexico since 1994, which demonstrate rejection of this neoliberal integration and construction of alternative governance, economies, and educational systems. And, these movements and frameworks, they show that different structures are possible, right? Though they face significant oppositions from states and capital that benefit from existing arrangements, they do show that this is possible. We can do things in a different way. It's not always easy. Several key scholarly debates that I want you to be aware of and think about in this concept that remain unresolved, and you should really, engage multiple perspectives rather than, again, always, we don't want to be thinking about just singular correct answers, right? But first, does resource wealth cause poor development outcomes? Or is the correlation driven by confounding variables like colonial history, geography, pre-existing institutional weaknesses? The causal direction matters for policy implications, and it really needs more inquiry and more study. It's a complex relationship. I think second, as we discussed, are institutions endogenous to resource development, meaning, resources shape institutional development, or exogenously determined by historical factors, independent of resources. If exogenous, resource curse policies targeting institutions may be completely ineffective, right? And third, I want you to think about, can extractivism be progressive if revenues fund redistribution and poverty reduction, right? Or is extraction always inherently destructive, regardless of how revenues are used, right? This really relates to whether left-wing extractivism in examples like Bolivia and Venezuela represent viable alternative development paths, or are, just as bad as other ways, right? And fourth, right, is green transition possible without reproducing these extractive injustices, right? Or does renewable energy necessarily require sacrifice zones and exploitative labor, right? Are we gonna be able to solve the wicked problems if we don't make sacrifices, right? And if that is true, how do we ethically navigate climate mitigation when it requires harming some communities for broader benefit, right? Sacrifice some for the good of all? I don't know. Fifth, what economic models, exist beyond growth dependency? Donut economics, right? And how can we think about these ideas when global capitalism, it requires this continuous expansion, right? Capitalism needs this to continue, right? Can degrowth or steady state economies function at a national scale? Or only in localized experiments like in Mexico, right? We've never seen it succeed at a large scale, right? These questions, they really have real implications for environmental governance and justice. These are not just academic interests, but these are great questions that you could consider, for your proposal, for your action plans, and for your own personal work. Questions that many scholars are grappling with, including myself, every day. Some methodological considerations for analyzing these structures. This includes several critical issues. First, we need to avoid economic determinism. Structures constrain possibilities, they shape incentives, but they don't entirely dictate outcomes, okay? Human agency and political mobilization matter. They matter. Things are not just set in stone. Second, historical specificity is essential, right? Dutch disease operated differently in the Netherlands, which had strong institutions and diversified economy, versus Nigeria, which inherited colonial extraction-oriented institutions, right? Context determines whether general patterns apply. We cannot make generalizations. We need to be careful. Third, multi-scale analysis is necessary because we can't make generalizations, right? Global structures, national policies, local impacts, these interact in complex ways. A comprehensive analysis, it must examine multiple scales simultaneously. I've said this many, many times. There's a theme here. Fourth, power mapping. Sound familiar? Power mapping identifies who specifically benefits from particular arrangements. We need to do this. We need to understand this. National interest rhetoric is often a charade that is masking how benefits are concentrating among particular elites while costs are being distributed broadly. Consider that, right? Fifth, intersectional analysis, which I will devote an entire lecture to ahead. This is really going to show how gender, race, class, and other identities can determine really how environmental justice manifests, is experienced, and how outcomes are shaped by these factors and experienced within communities. Incredibly important. For example, women may experience resource extraction differently than men, both in labor and environmental health impacts. It's very important to consider, and we have to take that into account in any work we're doing. Again, research positionality matters, right? Studying from global north versus global south positions, they really shape what questions are asked, whose knowledge is valued, what methods are used, and how findings are disseminated, right? Research should reflect explicitly on these methodological choices and their implications for knowledge production, right? Positionality was not just a fun activity I had you do, right? It's incredibly vital to this research. And environmental justice frameworks, we're coming back. These help us analyze these complex structures, these overwhelming concepts across multiple interconnected dimensions. Here's an example. Distributive justice, examines these resources, the profits versus who's getting the pollution exposure, right? Health impacts, livelihood destruction. In Nigeria's Delta, multinational corporations and government elites were receiving oil revenue while local community were experiencing the spills, the pollution, losing fisheries, right? Procedural justice, again, asking whether affected communities are participating meaningfully, right? This, could be an example of, a trade agreement, a bilateral investment that's excluding communities from the decisions about their country's own economic policies and resource governance, right? Recognitional injustices may appear as, neoliberal framings of nature as resource to be commodified and traded, violating indigenous ontologies, right? It's incompatible worldviews. And power structural injustice is going to determine which prevails, right? But also structural justice can take the form of these investment treaties or other institutional arrangements that are going to entrench vulnerability rather than creating opportunities for poverty alleviation or transformation, right? Even, again, well-intentioned individual actions, they operate within these structures that can limit possibilities, right? I have to consider these things, I have to take these things to account. So I hope this has, made you think a little bit deeper about some of these structures, some of these systems that we operate within. Again, I wanted to give you these topics as kind of a global interrogation of environmental justice. But again, you can apply this directly to your own work, to your final projects. You can think about this in terms of things going on in America, right? Neoliberalism, neocolonialism, resource dependency, they're not, again, abstract economic concepts. They are material structures. We can measure their consequences. And they have real impacts on environmental governance and human well-being, right? Neoliberalism deeply shapes environmental policy through specific mechanism: privatization, deregulation, fiscal austerity, and prioritization of market mechanisms over regulation in many cases, or community control and management, right? These are political choices with beneficiaries. They are not natural economic laws, okay? Neocolonialism, it names continuities in extraction and control between colonial and contemporary periods, right? It is a remanifestation, right? Independence did not end exploitation for many individuals, many countries, many people. It transformed mechanisms through which it operates. It's slow and structural violence, right? Resource dependency is creating structural vulnerability across the globe that is really limiting options regardless of government intentions, okay? The resource curse is not fate or cultural deficiency. It's the outcome of specific policy choices and power relations that are still serving particular interests that hearken from colonial times, right? Justice and environmental justice, it requires transforming these structures, not just mitigating their symptoms, right? Individual actions matter. Don't get me wrong. An individual agency exists, and actions occur within contexts that are distributing possibilities unequally, okay? Some actors have choices, while others face only constrained options, okay? None of them good in many cases. We have to understand these structural dynamics. It's absolutely necessary for understanding environmental justice work if we're going to get to the root causes rather than just addressing the symptoms, okay? Research your work, the future that you hold with these lessons. You sit at the intersection, right? Conservation priorities, agricultural policies, debt structures, power asymmetries, the question of who decides and who benefits, right? These tensions, they don't resolve easily. It's not easy work, but recognizing them clearly, it's really a necessary starting point for scholarship and practice that's going to advance justice rather than just reproducing these existing inequalities. So again, I thank you so much. Again, history matters because colonial patterns persist. Resistance exists and alternatives are possible, but they require changing fundamental assumptions about growth, development, and humanity's relationship to nature. Let's watch some, read and watch some Murray Bookchin like we did in the beginning, right? There's a lot of work ahead. Thanks so much.